The train lurched to a stop, and Clara Whitmore's hands trembled as she smoothed her travel-worn dress. In her reticule lay a single letter, a promise of marriage from a man she'd never met. Behind her, debts that could send her to debtor's prison. Ahead, a stranger who held her entire future in his hands. But when she stepped onto that dusty platform in Red Hollow, Colorado, the man waiting wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for an excuse, and with one cold glance, he shattered everything she'd gambled on that scorching summer day in 1878. If you want to see how Clara's story unfolds in this wild frontier town, stay with me until the end, and please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The conductor's voice rang through the passenger car like a death knell. Red Hollow, Colorado, final stop. Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she strained to catch her first glimpse of the town that would become her new home. Through the settling dust kicked up by the locomotive's wheels, she could make out a collection of weathered buildings lining a single wide street. False-fronted shops stood shoulder to shoulder with a saloon, a general store, and what appeared to be a hotel with a sagging porch. Beyond the town, the land stretched endlessly toward purple mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the cloudless sky. Her stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Miss, we've arrived. The elderly woman who'd shared her bench for the last 100 miles touched Clara's arm gently. Are you quite certain about this arrangement? Clara turned to meet the woman's concerned gaze. Mrs. Henderson had been kind throughout the journey, sharing her lunch and listening with sympathetic silence as Clara had confessed the circumstances that brought her west. Now, in the harsh afternoon light streaming through the train window, Clara could see the doubt written plainly on her traveling companion's weathered face. I have no choice, Clara said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. There's nothing left for me in Philadelphia. My father's debts. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Even now, 3 months after his death, the words caught in her throat like glass shards. Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hand. Sometimes the Lord closes one door to open another, dear. Perhaps this Mr. Thornton will be a good man. Clara managed a weak smile, though she felt anything but confident. She'd answered the advertisement on a cold February morning, sitting in the drawing room of the house she'd soon lose to creditors. The words had seemed straightforward enough. Respectable rancher seeks educated woman of good character for marriage. Correspondence welcomed. Transportation provided. Over the subsequent months, she and Samuel Thornton had exchanged exactly 4 letters. His had been brief and businesslike, outlining the basic facts of his life. A successful cattle operation, a comfortable home, a need for a wife to help manage his household and provide companionship. He'd sent a photograph, a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and hard eyes standing rigidly beside a fence post. Her letters had been equally restrained. She described her education, her skills in household management, her situation with careful euphemisms that didn't quite hide the desperation beneath. She'd sent her own photograph, taken 2 years earlier when her father had still been alive and the world had made sense. And now here she was, stepping off a train in a territory so far from everything she'd known that it might as well be another country entirely. The platform was crowded with people. Ranchers in dust-covered clothing, women in simple calico dresses, children darting between adults with wild abandon. The air smelled of smoke and horses, and something else. Something wild and vast that Clara had never encountered in the ordered streets of Philadelphia. She gripped her single suitcase with both hands, scanning the crowd for a man who matched the photograph burned into her memory. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Miss Whitmore? The voice came from behind her, and Clara spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance. The man standing there was indeed Samuel Thornton. She recognized the mustache, the severe set of his jaw, but his expression bore none of the neutral courtesy she might have hoped for. Instead, his eyes were cold, assessing, and unmistakably disappointed. Mr. Thornton. She dipped her head in greeting, trying to ignore the sick feeling spreading through her chest. I'm so pleased to finally meet you. He didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, his gaze swept over her from head to toe in a manner that made her feel like livestock at auction. The inspection lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When his eyes finally met hers again, Clara saw her worst fears confirmed in their depths. "You're older than your photograph suggested," he said flatly. The words struck like a physical blow. Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, acutely aware of the other passengers moving around them, some glancing their way with undisguised curiosity. The photograph was taken 2 years ago," she managed, hating the apologetic tremor in her voice. "I can assure you I'm exactly as I described in my letters. I'm 26 years old and 26. He repeated the number as if it were a condemnation. "You wrote that you were of marriageable age. I assumed you meant younger. 26 is practically an old maid." The casual cruelty of the assessment left Clara momentarily speechless. She'd known, of course, that her age worked against her. Most women married in their late teens or early 20s, but she'd spent those years caring for her ailing mother and then trying to hold together her father's failing business after her mother's death. She'd sacrificed her own prospects for duty and love, and now this stranger was reducing all of that to a single dismissive phrase. Practically an old maid. "Mr. Thornton, I've traveled over 1,000 miles. At my expense, yes." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and thrust it toward her. "Here. A ticket for tomorrow morning's eastbound train, and $50 for your trouble. I suggest you find a room at the hotel tonight. Mrs. Brennan runs a respectable establishment." Clara stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Around them, the platform had grown quieter. She could feel eyes on them now, could sense the attention of strangers drawn to this public rejection playing out in the afternoon sun. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had an agreement. I sold everything I owned to settle my affairs before coming here. I have no home to return to." Something flickered across Thornton's face. Was it guilt? But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by rigid stubbornness. "I'm sorry for your circumstances, Miss Whitmore, truly I am, but I can't in good conscience proceed with this arrangement. You're not what I expected. The photograph was misleading." "The photograph was honest. I sent you the most recent one I had. You sent me a picture of a young woman." His voice rose slightly, drawing more stares. "I need a wife who can give me children, who can work hard for many years. I need—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was making a scene. "This conversation is pointless. Take the ticket and the money. It's more than generous under the circumstances." Clara's hands shook as fury and humiliation warred within her chest. She wanted to slap him, to scream, to demand the justice she deserved. But she was alone in a strange town, surrounded by strangers, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She took the envelope. "You are not a gentleman, Mr. Thornton," she said quietly, proud when her voice didn't break. "And I am grateful to discover your true character before binding myself to you for life. I pity the woman who eventually makes that mistake." She turned on her heel and walked toward the hotel, her spine straight and her head high. Even as her vision blurred with tears, she refused to let fall where anyone could see them. The Red Hollow Hotel stood at the far end of the main street, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Clara climbed the steps on legs that felt like water, still clutching her suitcase and the envelope that represented the complete destruction of her plans. The lobby was small but clean, with a registration desk to one side and a few worn chairs arranged near a cold fireplace. Behind the desk sat a plump woman in her 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked up as Clara entered, and her expression shifted immediately from professional welcome to concerned sympathy. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "you must be the bride who came in on the afternoon train." The kindness in her voice nearly shattered Clara's composure. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm Martha Brennan. I run this place." The woman came around the desk and gently took the suitcase from Clara's white-knuckled grip. "Come on back here and sit down. You look about ready to fall over." She guided Clara to a small sitting room off the main lobby, a cozy space with a worn sofa and a window that looked out onto the street. Once Clara was seated, Martha disappeared and returned moments later with a cup of tea and a concerned expression that threatened to undo all of Clara's carefully maintained control. "I heard what happened," Martha said, settling into the chair across from Clara. "The whole platform heard, I'm afraid. Sam Thornton's got a voice that carries when he wants it to." Clara wrapped her hands around the teacup, grateful for something to hold on to. Does everyone know about the arrangement? In a town this size, honey, everyone knew you were coming before you even left Philadelphia. Martha's tone was matter-of-fact rather than unkind. Don't worry about gossip. Folks here have seen stranger things than a mail-order bride, and most of them think Sam Thornton is a first-class fool for sending you packing. He said I was too old, Clara heard herself say. That my photograph was misleading. Martha snorted indelicately. Sam Thornton wouldn't know a blessing if it walked up and introduced itself. He's been looking for a wife for 3 years now, and he's sent back 2 others before you. Problem isn't your age or your photograph, honey. Problem is Sam wants a servant, not a partner. He wants someone too young and too desperate to question his authority. The words should have been comforting, but they only made Clara feel worse. Then I should be perfect for him, she said bitterly. I'm certainly desperate enough. But you're not weak, and you're not stupid. He could see that the moment he laid eyes on you. Martha leaned forward. Look, I don't know your full story, and you don't have to tell me, but I've been running this hotel for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of people come through Red Hollow for all sorts of reasons. Some running away, some running towards something. Either way, what matters is what you do once you get here. Clara set down her teacup with trembling hands. I don't know what to do. I used the last of my money to settle my father's debts before I left. That ticket Thornton gave me, tomorrow's train is my only way out. But going back means... She trailed off, unable to articulate the hopelessness waiting for her in Philadelphia. Then don't go back. Both women turned toward the doorway, where a man had appeared so quietly neither had noticed his approach. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, and they regarded Clara with an intensity that made her straighten instinctively. Ethan Cole, Martha said, rising to her feet. What are you doing lurking in doorways? I was coming to settle my account when I heard voices. He stepped fully into the room, and Clara noticed he moved with a slight limp. Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help overhearing your situation, Miss Whitmore, Clara supplied, getting to her feet as well. She was a tall woman herself, but he still topped her by several inches. Clara Whitmore. Ethan runs the Double C Ranch about 5 miles north of town, Martha explained. He's one of the few ranchers around here with any sense in his head. Ethan ignored the compliment. His attention focused on Clara. I have a proposition for you, Miss Whitmore, if you're interested in hearing it. Clara's heart sank. She'd heard enough propositions for one day, and she had no desire to trade one humiliating situation for another. Mr. Cole, I appreciate your... I need a housekeeper, he interrupted, his tone businesslike. My last one left to get married about 3 months ago, and the place has gone to hell since then. I've got 4 ranch hands living in the bunkhouse, and we're all pretty much living on beans and whatever we can scrape together. The main house is a disaster. I'd hire you for 3 months, room and board, plus $30 a month. At the end of that time, you can decide if you want to stay or take your wages and move on to somewhere else. Somewhere better than whatever you left behind. Clara stared at him, trying to process the offer. You want to hire me? Just like that? You don't even know me. I know you were brave enough to travel halfway across the country to start a new life. I know Sam Thornton's a jackass who couldn't see a good thing if it bit him. And I know Martha here has been giving me hell for months about the state of my house. He glanced at Martha, who was nodding approvingly. That's more than I knew about the last 3 hands I hired, and they worked out fine. This is different, Clara protested. I'm a woman alone. It wouldn't be proper. I've got a cook's quarters off the kitchen that's completely separate from the rest of the house. You'd have your own space, your own door with a lock. And I'm not looking for anything beyond honest work for honest pay, Miss Whitmore. I can have Martha come out once a week to check on things, if it'd make you more comfortable. Martha made a dismissive sound. Ethan Cole's one of the few truly decent men in this territory, honey. You'd be safer at his ranch than you'd be in most places. And it'd give you time to figure out your next move without having to go crawling back east with your tail between your legs. Clara looked between them, her mind racing. It wasn't what she'd come here for. It wasn't marriage or security or any of the things she'd hoped to find when she'd boarded that train in Philadelphia. But it was something. It was a chance. And what did she really have to lose? 3 months, she said slowly. Room and board and $30 a month. That's right. And at the end of that time, I'm free to leave if I choose. Free as a bird. Ethan extended his hand. Do we have a deal, Miss Whitmore? Clara looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from hard work, but steady and sure. She thought about the ticket in her pocket, about Philadelphia and the debts and the empty house where her father had died. She thought about Samuel Thornton's cold dismissal, about being called an old maid on a dusty train platform while strangers watched. Then she thought about what Martha had said. What matters is what you do once you get here. She reached out and shook Ethan Cole's hand. We have a deal, Mr. Cole. The wagon ride to the Double C Ranch took almost an hour, following a rutted road that wound through high desert grassland dotted with sage and juniper. Ethan drove in silence, clearly a man more comfortable with action than words, and Clara was grateful for the quiet. It gave her time to absorb what she'd just agreed to. The landscape was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Back east, the land had been tamed and ordered, divided into neat parcels with proper fences and established roads. Here, everything felt wild and unfinished, as if creation had stopped halfway through and moved on to other projects. The mountains loomed larger as they traveled north, their peaks still topped with snow despite the summer heat. Those are the San Juan Range, Ethan said, following her gaze. Beautiful in their way, but brutal if you don't respect them. Lost 3 head of cattle in a late spring blizzard 2 years back because I thought I knew better than the signs. It was the most he'd said since they'd left town. Clara glanced at him, trying to reconcile this quiet rancher with the impulsive offer he'd made less than an hour ago. He sat with easy confidence, the reins loose in his hands, his attention on the road ahead. May I ask you something, Mr. Cole? Might as well call me Ethan, seeing as we'll be working together. Ethan, then, why did you offer me this position? Surely there are other women in Red Hollow who could use the work. He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara wondered if she'd overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. I was at the train station picking up supplies when you arrived. Saw the whole thing with Thornton. He kept his eyes on the road. The way you held yourself after he dismissed you, head high, no crying or begging, reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who had more strength than anyone gave her credit for. Figured anyone with that kind of spine deserved a better hand than the one they'd been dealt. The unexpected kindness in the words made Clara's throat tight. I'm not sure I have as much strength as you think. You're here, aren't you? That takes strength. They fell silent again as the wagon crested a rise, and suddenly the ranch spread out before them. The main house was a sprawling, single-story structure built of rough-hewn logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Behind it stood a barn, several outbuildings, and a bunkhouse. A creek ran through the property, lined with cottonwood trees that provided the only real shade visible for miles. It was rough and unpolished, but there was something honest about it that appealed to Clara in a way she hadn't expected. It's not much, Ethan said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. But it's solid. My father built the main house 20 years ago, and I've been adding to it since I came back after the war. Clara climbed down from the wagon before he could help her, her legs stiff from the journey. Which war? The war between the states. I was with the Union Army, Cavalry Division. Came home in '65 with this bum leg and a head full of things I'd rather forget. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Ranch has been good for that. Hard to dwell on the past when you've got cattle to feed and fences to mend. He grabbed her suitcase and led her up the porch steps, which creaked under their weight. The front door opened with a protesting groan, and Clara got her first look at what would be her workplace for the next 3 months. The interior was dim and cluttered, with dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through dirty windows. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A dining table that could seat 8 was covered in papers, tools, and what appeared to be saddle repair equipment. Dirty plates were stacked on various surfaces, and the floor hadn't seen a proper sweeping in what looked like months. I warned you it was bad, Ethan said, setting down her suitcase with an apologetic grimace. Clara walked slowly through the space, taking inventory. The bones of the house were good, solid construction, well-proportioned rooms, quality furniture beneath the layer of neglect. It just needed someone who cared enough to tend to it. I've seen worse. she lied charitably. Ethan led her through to the kitchen, which was marginally better than the front room but still showed clear signs of bachelor living. A large cast-iron stove dominated one corner, and windows over the sink looked out toward the creek. A doorway on the far side opened into a small room that Ethan indicated was hers. The cook's quarters were simple but private. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a window with faded calico curtains. It was perhaps a quarter the size of her bedroom back in Philadelphia, but it was clean and it was hers. I had one of the boys sweep it out and put fresh linens on the bed when I rode into town this morning, Ethan said from the doorway. Like I said, there's a lock on this door, and you're the only one with a key. My room's on the other side of the house, past the parlor. The boys sleep in the bunkhouse, and they know better than to come to the main house uninvited. Clara set her suitcase on the bed and turned to face him. In the confined space of the small room, she was acutely aware of his size, though he maintained a respectful distance. I appreciate your discretion, Ethan, and your unexpected kindness. He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. We all need a hand up sometimes. I'll let you get settled. Supper's usually around 6, if you're up to joining us tonight. If not, I can bring you something here. I'll cook, Clara heard herself say. That's what you hired me for, isn't it? Might as well start now. A slow smile spread across Ethan's weathered face, transforming it completely. Yes, ma'am. Kitchen's all yours. I'll introduce you to the boys when they come in from the range. After he left, Clara sat on the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day. This morning she'd been a bride-to-be, full of nervous hope despite her doubts. Now she was a housekeeper on a remote Colorado ranch, working for a man she'd known for less than 2 hours. It wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't what she'd wanted. But as she looked around the small, clean room with its window facing the mountains, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Possibility. She had 3 months to figure out her life. 3 months to save money and make a plan. 3 months to prove, to Ethan, to this hard land, to herself, that she was more than Samuel Thornton's rejected bride. Clara stood, smoothed her dusty traveling dress, and headed for the kitchen. She had supper to make and a new life to begin. The pantry was better stocked than she'd expected, with basics like flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, and coffee. In the root cellar, she found potatoes, onions, and a few wrinkled apples. It wasn't much to work with, but she'd made meals from less during the lean months before her father died. She built up the fire in the stove, filled a large pot with water from the pump, and set to work. Her hands moved with familiar efficiency as she peeled potatoes, diced onions, and prepared to fry the salt pork. As she worked, she mentally cataloged everything the kitchen needed: proper organization, a thorough cleaning, some basic supplies to make meals less monotonous. The rhythm of the work was soothing. For the first time since boarding that train in Philadelphia, Clara felt her shoulders relax slightly. Here, at least, she knew what she was doing. Here, she had a purpose. She was just setting the table when she heard voices and boot steps on the porch. Ethan entered first, followed by 4 men in dusty work clothes who stopped short when they saw her. Boys, this is Miss Clara Whitmore. She'll be keeping house for us for a while. Ethan made a gesture that encompassed the group. Clara, these are my ranch hands. That's Miguel Torres, Jack Brennan, Martha's son, Tom Gardner, and the young one trying to hide behind Tom is Danny Foster. Miguel was clearly the oldest, probably in his early 40s, with graying black hair and a weathered face that creased pleasantly when he smiled. Pleased to meet you, Miss Whitmore. Whatever you're cooking smells like heaven. Jack Brennan was tall and thin, with his mother's kind eyes. He pulled off his hat and nodded respectfully. Ma sent word with Ethan that you'd accepted his offer. Welcome to the Double C, ma'am. Tom Gardner appeared to be in his mid-20s, with sandy hair and a ready grin. I hope you can cook better than Ethan, miss. We've been surviving on burnt steak and weak coffee for 3 months. I heard that, Ethan said mildly, but there was amusement in his voice. The youngest, Danny, looked barely 18. He was rail-thin and sunburned, and he ducked his head shyly when Clara smiled at him. Ma'am? He mumbled. Gentlemen, Clara said, feeling absurdly formal despite the casual circumstances. Supper's ready when you are. I'm afraid it's nothing fancy, just potatoes and salt pork, but I promise it won't be burnt. The meal that followed was unlike any Clara had experienced in her carefully ordered Philadelphia life. The men ate with single-minded focus, barely pausing between bites to offer compliments that were clearly genuine despite their rough delivery. The conversation was sparse but comfortable, mostly concerning ranch business, fence repairs needed in the north pasture, a possible cougar seen near the creek, plans for moving part of the herd to higher summer grazing. Clara found herself relaxing as she listened, asking occasional questions about the ranch and its operations. The men seemed surprised but pleased by her interest, and gradually the conversation became more animated. "You ever been on a ranch before, Miss Whitmore?" Tom asked, reaching for his third helping of potatoes. "Never. I'm a city girl, born and raised in Philadelphia." Clara refilled his coffee cup. "I'm afraid I know nothing about cattle or horses or any of it." "City girl, huh?" Miguel leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "What brought you all the way out here to Colorado?" The question created a sudden silence around the table. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she realized they all knew, of course they knew, in a town the size of Red Hollow, about her humiliation at the train station. "I came west to marry a man I'd never met," she said quietly, deciding that honesty was better than pretense. "It didn't work out. Your boss was kind enough to offer me employment instead." "Sam Thornton's a damn fool, I'd ski," Jack said bluntly, ignoring Ethan's warning look. "Begging your pardon, miss, but it's true. You could do a lot better." "That's enough," Ethan said firmly. "Clara's business is her own, and what happened at the station stays at the station. Anyone who gossips about it will answer to me. Understood?" The men nodded, properly chastened, and the conversation moved on to safer topics. But Clara caught Ethan's eye across the table and gave him a small nod of thanks. He acknowledged it with the briefest of smiles before turning his attention back to his meal. After supper, the ranch hands returned to the bunkhouse while Clara insisted on cleaning up alone. Ethan had retreated to his room to work on account books, leaving her in peaceful solitude as she washed dishes and put the kitchen to rights. Through the window above the sink, she could see the last light fading from the sky, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The air coming through the open window was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing in their pens. Clara dried the last plate and stood for a moment, letting herself simply exist in this strange new place. She thought about Philadelphia, about the cramped boarding house where she'd spent her last night before the train, about the debts and the shame and the crushing weight of having nowhere to go. She thought about Samuel Thornton's cold eyes and dismissive words. Then she thought about Ethan Cole's unexpected offer, about the respectful way the ranch hands had treated her, about the simple satisfaction of cooking a meal and seeing it appreciated. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd hoped for when she'd answered that advertisement. It wasn't romance or security or any of the dreams she'd carried west, but maybe, just maybe, it was something better. It was a chance to rebuild, a chance to prove herself on her own terms, a chance to discover who Clara Whitmore could be when she wasn't defined by debt or duty or the expectations of a society that had little use for unmarried women of 26. She hung the dish towel to dry and headed for her small room, suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of the day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A house to clean, meals to cook, a life to figure out. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Whitmore went to sleep with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and men's voices carrying across the yard. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was too small, the air smelled wrong, the sounds were all unfamiliar. Then memory flooded back, and with it came the strange mixture of relief and uncertainty that had become her constant companion. She dressed quickly in her oldest work dress, a plain gray cotton that had seen better days but was serviceable enough for the tasks ahead. After splashing cold water on her face from the washstand, she pinned her dark hair into a tight bun and surveyed herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her had shadows under her eyes and worry lines that hadn't been there a year ago, but her jaw was set with determination. The kitchen was empty when she entered, though she could see through the window that lamps were already burning in the bunkhouse. She built up the fire in the stove and started coffee, then began pulling out supplies for breakfast. Within an hour, she had biscuits in the oven, bacon sizzling in a large cast-iron skillet, and scrambled eggs ready to cook once the men arrived. Ethan was the first to appear, his dark hair still damp from washing. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, surprise flickering across his face. "You didn't have to start this early," he said, moving to pour himself coffee. "I usually just grab something cold and get to work." "That's a terrible way to begin the day." Clara cracked eggs into a bowl with practiced efficiency. "A proper breakfast will keep the men working harder and longer. Trust me, it's worth the time." A hint of a smile tugged at his mouth. "Yes, ma'am." The ranch hands filed in shortly after, bringing with them the smell of hay and leather and the crisp morning air. Their eyes widened at the sight of the table laden with hot food, and Miguel actually removed his hat and pressed it to his chest in a gesture of theatrical reverence. "Miss Whitmore, if you cook like this every morning, we'll all be too fat to sit a horse by winter." "Then you'd better work it off," Claire replied, pleased by their obvious appreciation. "Now sit down and eat before it gets cold." The breakfast conversation was livelier than supper had been, with the men discussing the day's work between mouthfuls of food. They needed to move part of the herd to the summer pasture, repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, and check on a water source that might be running dry. "I'll ride out with Miguel and Jack to move the cattle," Ethan said, draining his coffee cup. "Tom, you and Danny handle the fence repairs. We should be back by late afternoon unless we run into trouble." Clara listened as she refilled coffee cups and cleared empty plates, filing away information about the ranch's operations. She was beginning to understand the rhythm of this place, the constant cycle of work dictated by weather, seasons, and the needs of the animals. It was so different from the structured predictability of city life, where time was measured by clock towers and train schedules rather than sunrise and cattle. After the men departed, she stood in the doorway and watched them ride out, a line of silhouettes against the brightening eastern sky. The isolation of the ranch struck her suddenly. The nearest neighbor was miles away, the town was an hour's wagon ride, and she was utterly alone in this house that wasn't hers, in this life she'd stumbled into by accident. She pushed the thought away and turned back to the overwhelming task before her. The house needed a thorough cleaning, top to bottom, and she might as well start immediately. For the next several hours, Clara worked with single-minded determination. She opened windows to air out rooms that smelled of dust and masculine neglect. She swept floors, scrubbed surfaces, and organized the chaotic jumble of belongings that had accumulated like driftwood in forgotten corners. In Ethan's study, she found stacks of books mixed indiscriminately with ranch records, old newspapers, and broken equipment. She created order from chaos, dusting each volume and arranging them on shelves by subject. The titles surprised her. Not just practical manuals about animal husbandry and land management, but poetry by Wordsworth and Keats, novels by Dickens and Scott, philosophy by Emerson and Thoreau. She paused over a well-worn copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, noting the passages marked in pencil, the careful annotations in the margins. Ethan Cole was clearly more than just a rough cattleman. By midday, her back ached and her hands were raw, but the transformation was remarkable. The main room actually looked like a home now, with clean windows allowing sunlight to pour across scrubbed floors and polished furniture. She'd found curtains stored in a trunk and hung them in the parlor, adding a touch of softness to the rough-hewn space. She was attacking the kitchen with equal vigor when she heard a wagon approaching. Wiping sweat from her forehead, Clara went to the door and was surprised to see Martha Brennan climbing down from the driver's seat, a large basket balanced on one arm. "Thought I'd ride out and check on you," Martha called cheerfully. "Brought some things from town, fresh bread, eggs, a few vegetables from my garden." Clara helped her carry the supplies inside, grateful for both the food and the company. Martha looked around the transformed kitchen with obvious approval. "Well, you don't waste time, do you? This place looks better than it has in years." She set the basket on the now spotless table. "How are you settling in?" "It's different from what I expected," Clara admitted, putting water on for tea. "But the work is honest, and the men have been respectful. Ethan is kind." Martha's shrewd eyes studied her face. "He's a good man. Lost his wife about 5 years back. Consumption took her after only 2 years of marriage. Threw himself into building this ranch after that, like he could outrun the grief if he just worked hard enough." The revelation caught Clara off guard. She thought of the bedroom she hadn't cleaned yet, wondering if it still held traces of the woman who'd died there. "I didn't know he'd been married." "Not many folks do. He doesn't talk about Sarah much. Martha accepted the tea Clara poured for her. But I'm telling you so you understand. Ethan Cole knows what it's like to have your plans torn apart. That's probably why he offered you this job. He recognizes that kind of loss. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Clara found herself opening up in a way she hadn't expected. She told Martha about her father's death, about the debts that had swallowed everything, about the desperate hope that had driven her to answer Samuel Thornton's advertisement. I thought I could make a practical arrangement work, she said quietly. I didn't need romance or passion. I just needed security, a place to belong. But Thornton didn't even give me a chance to prove myself. Because he's a coward who wants a servant, not an equal. Martha reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. Listen to me, honey. You're going to be just fine here. Give yourself time to figure things out. 3 months is longer than you think. After Martha left, Clara returned to her cleaning with renewed energy. She tackled the parlor next, discovering treasures hidden under layers of dust, a beautiful Chinese vase, a chess set carved from dark wood, a collection of daguerreotypes showing a younger Ethan with his parents and siblings. She studied one photograph that showed a slender woman with kind eyes standing beside Ethan, both of them dressed in wedding clothes. Sarah, she thought, the wife he'd loved and lost. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when she heard horses returning. Clara quickly washed her face and hands, smoothed her hair, and started preparing supper. She'd found a ham in the smokehouse and had it roasting with potatoes and carrots. The smell filled the kitchen with warmth and comfort. Ethan appeared in the doorway, covered in trail dust, and stopped dead when he saw the transformation of his home. His eyes traveled slowly around the room, taking in the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the curtains moving gently in the evening breeze. I hardly recognize the place, he said softly. I hope you don't mind. I found the curtains in a trunk in the spare room. If you'd rather I put them back. No? His voice was rough. Thank you, Clara. You've done more in one day than I could have imagined. Over supper, the men peppered Clara with questions about Philadelphia, what it was like to live in a big city, whether she'd ever seen the ocean, what kind of work her father had done. She answered as best she could, painting pictures of cobblestone streets and gas lamps, of theaters and concerts and libraries that held more books than the entire population of Red Hollow. Don't you miss it? Danny asked, his young face wistful. All that excitement and civilization? Clara considered the question carefully. I miss some things. The library mostly, the concerts, but I don't miss the crowding, the noise, the way everyone's always in a hurry to get somewhere. There's something peaceful about this place. Room to breathe. Room to get lost, too, Tom said with a grin. Wait till you've been here a few months and seen nothing but cattle and sagebrush for weeks on end. You might change your tune. But Clara didn't think she would. There was a simplicity to ranch life that appealed to something deep in her spirit. The work was hard and physical, but it was honest. You could see the results of your labor immediately. A clean house, a good meal, satisfied faces around the table. That night, exhausted from the day's work, Clara sat in her small room and wrote a letter to her cousin Margaret in Philadelphia. She described the ranch, the vast landscape, the unexpected kindness she'd found in this rough place. She didn't mention Samuel Thornton or her humiliation at the train station. Some things were better left unsaid. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Clara rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing different parts of the house, cooked substantial midday and evening meals, and used the quiet afternoons to mend clothes, tend the small vegetable garden she'd discovered behind the house, or read from Ethan's extensive library. The ranch hands grew comfortable with her presence, joking with her at meals and offering to help with heavy tasks. Miguel taught her the Spanish names for different plants and animals. Jack told her stories about growing up in Red Hollow and the wild early days of the territory. Even shy Danny began to open up, confessing his dreams of one day owning his own ranch. But it was Ethan who surprised her most. In the evenings, after the other men had retired to the bunkhouse, he would sometimes linger in the kitchen while she cleaned up from supper. At first, their conversations were brief and practical, what supplies needed to be ordered from town, whether she needed anything for the house. But gradually, as the days stretched into weeks, they began to talk about other things. One evening, about 3 weeks into her employment, Clara found Ethan in his study, staring at account books with a frustrated expression. "Problems?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, startled, then gestured at the papers spread before him. "Trying to figure out if I can afford to buy breeding stock from a rancher down in New Mexico. The numbers work if we have a good winter and don't lose too many head, but it's a gamble." Clara moved closer, studying the neat columns of figures. "May I?" At his nod, she sat across from him and began reviewing his calculations. Her father had run a dry goods business, and she'd kept his books for years. Numbers made sense to her in a way that few other things did. "Your arithmetic is fine, but you're being too conservative here," she said, pointing to a column. "You've budgeted for a 20% loss over winter, but Martha told me you've never lost more than 10% in any year she can remember, and you're not accounting for the revenue from selling the yearlings in spring." Ethan leaned forward, interested. "You understand accounting?" "I managed my father's books for 5 years." Clara made quick notations on a spare piece of paper. "If you adjust these figures and factor in the yearling sales, you can afford the breeding stock with money to spare. It's a sound investment." He studied her calculations in silence, and Clara held her breath, wondering if she'd overstepped. But when he looked up, there was respect in his eyes that warmed her more than any compliment could have. "You're absolutely right. I don't know why I didn't see it." He sat back, shaking his head. "Sarah used to help me with this kind of thing. Since she died, I've been muddling through on my own, and I'm not very good at it." It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife to Clara directly. She chose her words carefully. "Martha told me about Sarah. I'm sorry for your loss. It was 5 years ago, but some days it feels like yesterday." His voice was quiet, reflective. "She was from back east, too. Boston. Came out here to be a teacher and ended up marrying a rancher instead. She loved this place, though. Used to say the mountains made her feel closer to heaven." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was." He met Clara's eyes. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in appearance, but in the way you face challenges. Sarah never complained about the hardships out here. She just rolled up her sleeves and did what needed to be done." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the comparison. "I'm just doing the job you hired me for. You're doing more than that, and we both know it." Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. "This house feels alive again, Clara, like it's waking up from a long sleep. The men are happier, better fed, more focused on their work, and He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "I look forward to coming home now. That hasn't been true in a long time." The confession hung in the air between them, intimate and unexpected. Clara didn't know how to respond, so she simply said, "I'm glad I can be useful." "You're more than useful." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight his features seemed softer, more open. "You're valuable. To this ranch, and to everyone on it." Before Clara could reply, they heard shouting from outside. Ethan moved instantly toward the door, his hand dropping instinctively to the revolver he wore on his hip. Clara followed, her heart suddenly racing. In the yard, they found Miguel and Jack supporting a groaning Tom between them. His shirt was soaked with blood, and his face was pale in the moonlight. "Cougar," Jack said tersely. "Attacked him up by the North Creek. Tore up his arm pretty bad before we could drive it off." "Get him inside," Claire said, her voice steady despite the shock flooding her system. "Put him on the kitchen table. Ethan, I need clean cloths, hot water, and whiskey. Miguel, bring all the lamps you can find." She was moving before she fully processed what she was doing, years of caring for her ailing mother taking over. She'd dressed wounds before, though never anything quite this severe. Tom's arm was badly lacerated, with deep claw marks that ran from shoulder to elbow. "This is going to hurt," she told Tom, who was barely conscious. "But I need to clean it before I can stitch it up." "You know how to stitch wounds?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with concern. "I helped the doctor care for my mother during her final illness. He taught me the basics." Clara accepted the supplies Miguel brought, her hands rock steady despite her racing heart. "Tom, bite down on this." She handed him a leather strap. "Ethan, hold him still." What followed was brutal but necessary. Clara cleaned the wounds with whiskey, her stomach churning as Tom screamed against the leather. She stitched the deepest gashes with careful, even sutures, her fingers remembering the technique the Philadelphia doctor had shown her. Through it all, Ethan held Tom's shoulders down with gentle firmness, murmuring encouragement in a low, steady voice. When it was finally done, Tom had passed out from the pain, and Clara's dress was stained with his blood. She bandaged the arm carefully, then stood back, trembling with delayed reaction. "We need to watch him for fever," she said, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "The next 48 hours will be critical. If the wounds become infected—" "You did good, Clara." Ethan's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "Real good. Tom's lucky you were here." Miguel and Jack carried Tom to one of the spare bedrooms, and Clara insisted on sitting with him through the night, checking his temperature and changing his bandages every few hours. Ethan stayed as well, keeping vigil from a chair in the corner, ready to help if she needed anything. Around 3 in the morning, with Tom sleeping fitfully and his fever still manageable, Ethan spoke quietly from his chair. "Where did you learn to stay so calm under pressure?" Clara looked up from where she was bathing Tom's forehead with cool water. "My mother's illness lasted 2 years. There were many nights like this, watching for fever, trying to manage pain. You learn to put aside your own fear and just do what needs to be done." "That's the second time you've mentioned your mother. What about your father?" She hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding her history. "My father owned a dry goods store in Philadelphia. When my mother died, he lost himself in grief and bad business decisions. By the time I realized how deep the debts had gotten, it was too late to save the business. He died of a heart ailment 6 months ago, leaving me with nothing but creditors at the door." "So you answered Thornton's advertisement." "I had no other choice. An unmarried woman of 26 with no family and no money has very limited options. I could become a governess, a companion to some wealthy widow, or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what the alternative was. "And Thornton threw away what could have been the best thing that ever happened to him." Ethan's voice was rough with anger. "He's a fool. Or perhaps he simply saw something in me that warned him I wouldn't be the docile wife he wanted." Clara met his eyes across the dim room. "I've never been very good at accepting limitations, Ethan. My father used to say it would be my undoing. I think it might be your salvation instead." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning Clara didn't quite dare to examine. She turned her attention back to Tom, but she could feel Ethan's gaze on her, steady and warm in the darkness. Tom's fever broke on the second day, and by the end of the week, he was sitting up in bed and complaining about being confined to the house. Clara changed his bandages twice daily, pleased to see the wounds healing cleanly with no signs of infection. "You should have been a doctor," Tom said one afternoon as she redressed his arm. "You've got the touch for it." "Women can't be doctors," Clara replied automatically, though the unfairness of it stung. "They should be able to. You're better at this than the doc in town, and he's been practicing for 20 years. The incident with Tom's injury seemed to shift something fundamental in the household. The ranch hands began treating Clara with a new respect that bordered on reverence. Danny started calling her Miss Clara instead of the more formal Miss Whitmore. Miguel taught her how to make proper tortillas. Even Jack, Martha's son, began confiding in her about his hopes of courting a girl in town. But it was Ethan's behavior that changed most noticeably. He began seeking out her company in the evenings, not just for help with the account books, but for conversation. They discussed books. He was delighted to discover she'd read most of the volumes in his library and had strong opinions about them. They talked about the ranch and its future, and Clara found herself offering suggestions that Ethan actually implemented. They even debated politics and philosophy, with Clara defending positions that made Ethan laugh and shake his head in amused disagreement. "You'd have made a formidable suffragette," he told her one evening after a particularly spirited argument about women's rights. "You could talk circles around most men I know." Is that a compliment or a criticism?" "It's an observation." He smiled at her, and Clara felt something flutter in her chest that she firmly told herself was nothing more than appreciation for a kind employer. "And yes, it's a compliment. I like a woman who isn't afraid to speak her mind." As August arrived and the summer heat intensified, Clara realized with some shock that she'd been at the ranch for nearly 2 months. Her 3-month trial period was 2/3 complete, and she still had no clear plan for what would happen when it ended. She'd saved most of her wages, so she had enough money to travel somewhere else and start over. But the thought of leaving the Double C filled her with unexpected reluctance. She'd grown to love the rhythm of ranch life, the satisfaction of hard work and tangible results. She enjoyed the company of the men, their rough humor and genuine kindness. She'd come to cherish her evening conversations with Ethan, the way he listened to her opinions as if they mattered, the respect in his eyes when she demonstrated knowledge or skill. More troubling was the way her heart jumped when she heard his voice, the way she found herself watching for him to come in from the range, the warmth that flooded through her when he smiled. These were not the feelings of an employee for her employer. These were something far more dangerous. One afternoon in mid-August, Clara was in the vegetable garden when she heard unusual sounds from the direction of the main road, horses moving fast and men shouting. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a group of riders approaching the ranch at a gallop. Ethan and the other men were out checking fence lines, and Clara was alone at the house. Unease prickled down her spine as the riders drew closer. There were 5 of them, rough-looking men with hard faces and guns prominently displayed on their hips. The leader pulled his horse to a stop near the garden, looking down at Clara with eyes that made her skin crawl. He was perhaps 40, with a scarred face and a smile that held no warmth. "Well now, aren't you a pretty thing?" he drawled. "Where's Cole?" Clara straightened her spine, refusing to show fear. "Mr. Cole is out on the range. I expect him back shortly. May I ask your business?" "Our business is with Cole, not his servants." The man's eyes traveled over her in a way that made Clara feel exposed despite her high-necked dress. "Though I wouldn't mind waiting if the company's as pleasant as you." The other men laughed, and Clara felt her unease deepen into genuine alarm. She was utterly alone, with the nearest help miles away. "I'm afraid I can't invite you to wait," she said, keeping her voice level. "Mr. Cole wouldn't appreciate unexpected guests. If you'd like to leave a message, I'll see he receives it." "Oh, he'll receive our message soon enough." The leader leaned forward in his saddle. "You tell Cole that Marcus Brennan says he's got 1 week to clear out of the north pasture. That water source belongs to my ranch now, and I won't have his cattle fouling it." Marcus Brennan? Clara's mind raced. Martha had mentioned her estranged brother, the rancher who'd been trying to expand his holdings through intimidation and legal maneuvering. "I'll deliver your message." "You do that, sweetheart." Marcus's smile widened unpleasantly. "And you tell him if he's smart, he'll pack up and leave the territory entirely. Things have a way of getting dangerous for folks who don't know when they're beaten." It was a clear threat, and Clara felt anger flash through her fear. "Mr. Cole doesn't strike me as the type of man who frightens easily." "Then he's a fool." Marcus gathered his reins. "And fools don't last long in this country. You might want to remember that yourself." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Clara stood watching until they disappeared from sight. Only then did she allow herself to tremble, to feel the full weight of the menace that had hung in the air during that brief encounter. When Ethan and the ranch hands returned an hour later, she told them immediately what had happened. Ethan's face darkened with anger as she relayed Marcus's message, and the other men exchanged grim looks. "That bastard," Jack said, his hands clenching into fists. "Going after a woman when the men aren't around. That's low even for Marcus." "Did he threaten you directly?" Ethan asked Clara, his voice tight. "Not in so many words, but the implication was clear enough." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon heat. "He said things get dangerous for people who don't know when they're beaten." "What did he mean by that?" Ethan exchanged a look with Miguel, who nodded grimly. "Marcus Brennan has been trying to force me off this land for the past year," Ethan explained. "He wants the water rights to the North Creek and the summer pasture that goes with it. He's tried legal challenges, but the land is mine fair and square. My father homesteaded it 25 years ago, so now he's moving to intimidation." "What kind of intimidation?" "Cattle have disappeared. Fences get cut. Last month someone took shots at Miguel while he was riding the north boundary." Ethan's jaw was tight. "Nothing we can prove, but we all know it's Marcus's doing. And now he's threatening to escalate." Miguel's voice was grim. "Coming here while you were gone, scaring Miss Clara. That's a message, Ethan. He's telling you he can get to anything and anyone on this ranch." Clara felt her stomach clench with fear, but also with something else. A fierce protectiveness for this place and these people who'd given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. "What are you going to do?" she asked Ethan. "What I've been doing. Stand my ground and protect what's mine." He met her eyes, and she saw both determination and worry in his expression. "But I want you to stay close to the house from now on, Clara. Don't go anywhere alone. If riders come when we're not here, you get inside, lock the doors, and don't answer no matter what they say. Understood?" Clara nodded, though part of her bristled at being told to hide. "I understand." That night, Ethan posted watches, with the men taking turns keeping guard in 2-hour shifts. Clara lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of boots on the porch and low voices conferring in the darkness. The isolation of the ranch, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt threatening. They were alone out here, miles from help, vulnerable to any attack Marcus Brennan might decide to launch. But as the days passed and no further incidents occurred, the tension gradually eased. Clara returned to her routines, though now she found herself watching the road more carefully, and she noticed that one of the men always seemed to be within sight of the house. The crisis, when it came, arrived on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Clara was rolling out pie dough when she heard the first gunshot. The sharp crack echoed across the valley, and her hands froze mid-motion. For a heartbeat, she tried to convince herself it was something else, a branch breaking, a tool dropped in the barn. Then 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession, followed by shouting from the direction of the north pasture. She dropped the rolling pin and ran to the window. In the distance, she could see smoke rising and the dark shapes of riders moving fast across the rangeland. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she counted them. At least 8 men, maybe more, driving a section of Ethan's herd toward the boundary line. More shots cracked through the hot afternoon air, and now she could see Ethan and the ranch hands riding hard to intercept the rustlers. They were outnumbered, and Clara felt ice flood through her veins as she realized how badly this could end. She stood paralyzed for a moment, torn between the instinct to hide as Ethan had instructed and the desperate need to do something, anything, to help. Then she saw Danny's horse stumble and go down, throwing the young ranch hand hard onto the rocky ground. He didn't get up. The decision crystallized instantly. Clara hiked up her skirts and ran for the barn, her mind racing through possibilities. She couldn't shoot well enough to be useful in a gunfight, but she knew basic first aid, and if the men were injured, they would need help. She grabbed clean cloths from the supply shelf, filled a canteen with water, and was heading back toward the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Jack came thundering into the yard, his face pale beneath the dust and sweat. "Danny's hurt bad," he shouted, already wheeling his horse back around. "Ethan sent me to fetch you. Can you ride?" Clara had ridden exactly 3 times in her life, all of them sedately through Philadelphia parks. But she looked at Jack's desperate face and heard herself say, "Yes." He pulled her up behind him, and she wrapped her arms around his waist as he kicked the horse into a gallop. The ride was terrifying. Clara clung on with every ounce of strength she possessed, her teeth rattling with each jarring stride. The world blurred around her as they raced across the open range toward the sound of gunfire. They found Danny where he'd fallen, with Miguel kneeling beside him and Tom standing guard with his rifle, his recently healed arm apparently strong enough to shoot. The young ranch hand was conscious but clearly in agony, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Broke his leg when the horse went down," Miguel said grimly as Clara slid off Jack's horse and hurried to Danny's side. "Maybe his ribs, too, the way he's breathing." More gunshots erupted from beyond the rise, closer now. Clara pushed aside her fear and focused on Danny's ashen face. "I need to set the leg before we can move him," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Tom, I need straight branches for a splint. Miguel, hold him still." She worked as quickly as she dared, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Danny screamed when she straightened the leg, the sound cutting through her like a blade, but she didn't stop. She'd seen the doctor set her mother's broken wrist once, and had absorbed every detail of the process with the unconscious thoroughness that characterized how she approached everything. "You're doing fine, Danny," she murmured as she bound the splint tight with strips torn from her petticoat. "Just breathe through it. You're going to be fine." Jack appeared on the ridge above them, waving frantically. "They're coming this way. We need to move now." Miguel and Tom lifted Danny as gently as they could while Clara grabbed the medical supplies. They'd just reached the horses when a group of riders burst over the rise. Not the rustlers, but Ethan and 3 men Clara didn't recognize. Ethan's face was thunderous with rage, and there was blood on his shirt, though Clara couldn't tell if it was his own. Get Danny back to the house, Ethan ordered, his eyes sweeping over their small group and settling on Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. Relief mixed with anger, perhaps, or fear. The sheriff's men ran the rustlers off, but they'll be back. We need to ford up. The sheriff's men, it turned out, were a deputized posse from town who'd been tracking Marcus Brennan's gang for cattle theft across 3 counties. They'd arrived just in time to prevent a full-scale slaughter, but the danger was far from over. Back at the ranch, Clara converted the main room into a makeshift infirmary, while the men barricaded windows and positioned themselves at strategic points around the property. Danny's leg was definitely broken, possibly his ribs as well. One of the deputies had taken a bullet through the shoulder, and Ethan, despite his protests, had a deep gash across his ribs where a bullet had grazed him. "You need to sit still," Clara told him firmly, pushing him into a chair with more force than strictly necessary. Her fear was transforming into anger now that the immediate crisis had passed. "That wound needs cleaning before it gets infected." "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." She met his eyes, and something in her expression made him fall silent. "You could have been killed out there, Ethan. All of you could have been killed. And for what? Cattle? For our livelihood. For our land." His voice was quiet but unyielding. "This ranch is all I have, Clara. I won't let Marcus Brennan steal it through intimidation and violence. And I won't let you bleed out from stubbornness." She pulled his shirt open, trying not to notice the sculpted muscle beneath the blood and dirt, the old scars that mapped a history of violence and survival. "This is going to sting." She cleaned the wound with whiskey, and Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't make a sound. Clara found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his skin under her hands, the way his eyes tracked her every movement. The tension between them had been building for weeks, an unspoken current that ran beneath every conversation, every shared glance. Now, with her hands on his bare skin and death still hanging in the air around them, that tension felt almost unbearable. "You shouldn't have come out there," Ethan said quietly as she began stitching the wound closed. "I told you to stay at the house if there was trouble." "Danny needed help. Was I supposed to let him lie there and suffer because you told me to hide?" "I told you to hide because I can't—" He stopped abruptly, his hands curling into fists on his knees. "Because the thought of something happening to you tears me apart, Clara, and that's a problem." She finished the last stitch and tied it off, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Why is it a problem?" "Because you're my employee, because you're here temporarily, because in a few weeks your trial period ends and you'll move on to whatever life you're meant to have, and I have no right to feel what I'm feeling." Clara set down the needle with trembling hands. Around them, the house was full of armed men preparing for a possible siege, but in that moment, it felt like they were utterly alone. "And what exactly are you feeling?" Ethan stood abruptly, putting distance between them, and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting in streaks of crimson and gold, painting the mountains in shades of fire. His silhouette was dark against the fading light. "I told myself it was just gratitude," he said, his voice rough. "Appreciation for all you've done here, for bringing life back to this place. But that was a lie. I've been lying to myself for weeks now, maybe longer. Ethan, when I saw you ride up with Jack today, when I realized you'd put yourself in danger to help Danny, something inside me just broke open." He turned to face her, and the naked emotion in his eyes stole her breath. "I don't want you here as my housekeeper, Clara. I don't want you here for 3 months or 6 months or any defined period of time. I want you here as my partner, my wife. I want you to stay forever and help me build this ranch into something that matters. I want to wake up every morning knowing you'll be there, and I want to spend my evenings talking with you about books and dreams and everything under the sun. I want—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But that's not fair to you. You came here running from one bad situation, and here I am trying to trap you in another arrangement before you've even had time to figure out what you really want. So, I'm sorry. Forget I said anything. We'll just—" "Ethan." Clara crossed the room and took his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work, the strength tempered by gentleness. "What if I don't want to forget?" Hope flickered across his face, quickly suppressed. "Your 3 months aren't up yet. You haven't seen winter here, Haven't experienced how isolated it gets when the snows come. You haven't had time to really consider your options." "I've had nothing but time to consider my options." Clara tightened her grip on his hand. "Before I came here, I thought my choices were limited to finding a husband who would tolerate me in exchange for housework, or becoming some kind of dependent on the charity of others. I thought the best I could hope for was security, a roof over my head, maybe a measure of respect if I was very lucky." She paused, searching for the right words to express the transformation that had occurred in her over these past months. "But this ranch, these people, you've shown me there are other possibilities, that I can be valued for my mind as well as my domestic skills, that partnership can be built on mutual respect rather than desperation, that I'm capable of more than I ever imagined." "You're capable of anything you set your mind to," Ethan said softly. "That's what terrifies me. You could go anywhere, do anything. Why would you choose to stay here?" "Because this is the first place I've ever felt like I truly belonged." The words came out fierce and certain. "Because I love the work we do here, the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of building something that will last. Because I respect you more than any man I've ever known, and I—" Gunfire erupted outside, cutting off whatever she'd been about to say. Ethan immediately moved to shield her with his body as windows shattered and men shouted. The siege they'd been preparing for had finally arrived. The next hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Marcus Brennan's men had returned under cover of darkness, attempting to burn the barn and scatter the horses, but the sheriff's deputies and Ethan's ranch hands were ready for them. The fight was brutal, but brief. The rustlers hadn't expected organized resistance, and when 2 of their number went down with serious wounds, the rest fled into the darkness. Clara found herself pressed into service-binding wounds and administering whiskey for pain, moving between injured men with a calmness she didn't feel. One of the deputies had taken a bullet to the thigh. Miguel had been grazed across the temple and was bleeding profusely despite the superficial nature of the wound. Even Jack had suffered burns on his hands from beating out flames in the barn. Through it all, she was aware of Ethan moving through the house like a force of nature, checking defenses, encouraging his men, making strategic decisions with a clarity that spoke of military training. He'd been a cavalry officer, she remembered. He knew how to command, how to inspire confidence even in desperate circumstances. It wasn't until well past midnight that the threat finally passed. The sheriff's men had captured 3 of the rustlers, including Marcus Brennan himself, caught trying to sneak away after the failed attack. The rest had scattered into the mountains, and the deputies assured Ethan they would be hunted down and brought to justice. "Your testimony will be crucial," the sheriff told Ethan as they stood on the porch in the early morning darkness. "Marcus has been running roughshod over smaller ranchers for years, but we've never had enough evidence to make charges stick. This time, with multiple witnesses and deputies involved, we can put him away for a long time." After the sheriff and his men departed with their prisoners, an exhausted silence settled over the ranch. The other hands stumbled off to the bunkhouse, too tired even to properly celebrate their victory. Danny was sleeping fitfully in the spare bedroom, his leg elevated and splinted. The house smelled of gunpowder and blood and smoke. Clara stood at the kitchen sink, washing blood from her hands and trying to process everything that had happened. She felt hollowed out, scraped raw by fear and adrenaline and emotions she didn't know how to name. Ethan appeared in the doorway, still in his torn and bloodied shirt, exhaustion written in every line of his body. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the dim kitchen. "You were saying something," he said quietly. "Before the shooting started, you said you respected me, and then I was going to say that I think I'm falling in love with you." The words came out steady and sure, and Clara felt something tight in her chest finally release. "Actually, I don't think. I know. I've been falling in love with you for weeks now, probably since that first night when you offered me a chance instead of pity. And it terrifies me because it's nothing like what I expected, nothing like the practical arrangement I thought I wanted. It's bigger and more complicated and infinitely more precious." Ethan crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. Clara went willingly, burying her face against his chest and breathing in the scent of him beneath the smoke and sweat, leather and sage and something fundamentally his. His heart thundered against her ear, and his arms around her felt like coming home. "I love you," he said into her hair. I've loved you since the day you rode out to help Danny without a second thought for your own safety. Maybe before that. Maybe since I saw you standing on that train platform with your head held high, even though Thornton had just shattered your world. I don't know exactly when it happened, Clara, but I know I don't want to spend another day without you in my life. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. My 3-month trial period isn't over yet. We still have 2 weeks. To hell with the trial period. His hands came up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. Marry me, Clara. Not because you need security or because you have nowhere else to go, but because we fit together. Because we make each other better. Because I want to spend the rest of my life watching you transform everything you touch into something beautiful and worthwhile. That's quite a speech for a man who claims to be better with actions than words, Clara said, and felt a smile breaking across her face for the first time in hours. I've been practicing, he admitted, and then he was kissing her, tender and fierce and full of promise. Clara kissed him back with everything she had, all the fear and hope and love tangled up in her chest, finding expression in the meeting of their mouths. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara said, "Yes." "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay here and build this ranch with you. Yes to all of it." She reached up and touched his face, marveling at the wonder and joy that transformed his rough features. "But I have conditions." He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Of course you do. Well, I want to be a real partner, not just a wife who runs the household. I want to help with the business decisions, work on the account books, have a say in how we run this place." "Done. What else?" "I want us to start a lending library in town. There are people here who love to read but can't afford books. We could create a collection, maybe in Martha's hotel, and make it available to everyone." "I love that idea. Anything else?" Clara hesitated, then forged ahead. "I want to write to my cousin Margaret in Philadelphia and invite her to visit. She's trapped in the same kind of desperate situation I was in, and maybe she could find a new start here too. Not with you," she added quickly. "Obviously. But there are other ranchers, other opportunities. I just thought you could help her the way I helped you," Ethan finished. "That's perfect, Clara. That's exactly the kind of woman you are, and it's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you." They stood together in the quiet kitchen as dawn began to break outside, planning their future in low voices full of hope and certainty. They would rebuild the barn that had been damaged in the attack. They would expand the herd with the breeding stock Ethan had wanted to buy. They would face the winter together, and the spring, and all the seasons that followed. Over the next few days, as the ranch slowly returned to normal operations, Clara found herself navigating a strange new reality. She was still doing most of the same work, cooking, cleaning, tending to Danny's healing leg, but everything felt different now. The men treated her with a new kind of respect that recognized her position as Ethan's future wife. Martha came out from town with tears in her eyes and a fierce hug that nearly cracked Clara's ribs. "I knew it," Martha said triumphantly. "I knew from that first day that you two were meant for each other. Sam Thornton did you the biggest favor of your life when he sent you packing." The wedding planning happened quickly, partly because neither Clara nor Ethan saw any point in waiting, and partly because frontier life didn't allow for extended engagements. Martha took charge of organizing the celebration, declaring that the whole town would want to participate in such a momentous occasion. "It's not every day we get to celebrate true love," she said firmly, when Clara protested that a simple ceremony would suffice. "Let people have their joy, honey. After what happened with Marcus Brennan and his gang, this community needs something good to focus on." One evening, about a week after the attack, Clara was in Ethan's study, helping him draft a letter to the lawyer handling Marcus Brennan's prosecution, when he suddenly set down his pen and looked at her seriously. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Something I should have shown you before I proposed, but the timing never seemed right." He led her out of the house and toward the creek, following a path Clara had walked a dozen times before. But instead of stopping at the water's edge, as she usually did, Ethan continued along the creek bank until they reached a small rise she'd never bothered to explore. At the top of the rise, Clara stopped dead in astonishment. Below them, nestled in a protected hollow near the creek, stood the skeleton of a house. Not the old family home where they currently lived, but something new. a smaller structure with clean lines and large window frames that would offer sweeping views of the valley. I started building it about 2 months ago, Ethan said quietly, watching her face. I told myself it was just a project, something to do in my spare time. But the truth is, I was building it for you, for us. I just didn't want to admit it yet. Clara walked down the slope toward the structure, her heart in her throat. The foundation was solid stone, and the framing was nearly complete. She could see where the rooms would be: a large kitchen with windows facing east to catch the morning sun, a parlor with a fireplace, bedrooms tucked into the back for privacy. It's beautiful, she breathed, stepping carefully through the unfinished doorway. Ethan, it's ours. A fresh start, not built on anyone's memory, but our own. He came to stand beside her in what would become their parlor. The old house will always be the main ranch house, and it has good memories of my parents and of Sarah, but I wanted us to have something that belonged only to us from the very beginning. Clara turned to face him, overwhelmed by the enormity of his gesture. He'd been building their future before either of them had acknowledged what was happening between them. He'd been hoping and planning and creating, all while pretending it was just a project to fill empty hours. How long will it take to finish? She asked. If the men help during slow periods, probably another month, maybe 6 weeks. He pulled her close. I was thinking we could live in the old house after we marry and move here once it's complete. Make it our own before we start filling it with furniture and memories and maybe, eventually, children. The mention of children made Clara's breath catch. She'd long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood and the understanding that motherhood would never be part of her story. Now, suddenly, that future seemed not just possible, but probable. I like that plan, she said softly. All of it. They stood together in the unfinished house as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief and desperation that had driven her to answer Samuel Thornton's advertisement, the humiliation of being rejected on that dusty train platform, the unexpected kindness of a quiet rancher who'd offered her a chance instead of charity. She thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that train just 3 months ago, frightened, uncertain, convinced her best years were behind her. And she thought about the woman she was becoming, strong, capable, valued, loved. I need to tell you something, Clara said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. When I came here, I was so focused on what I'd lost that I couldn't see what might be ahead. I thought the best I could hope for was survival, a practical arrangement that would keep me fed and housed. I thought passion and partnership and genuine love were things that happened to other people, younger people, people whose lives hadn't already been marked by failure and loss. She turned in his arms to face him fully. But you showed me I was wrong about all of it. You showed me that love isn't about age or circumstance, or following some predetermined path. It's about finding someone who sees you clearly and values you completely. Someone who makes you want to be braver and stronger and more generous than you ever imagined you could be. Clara, let me finish. She touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. I came here as Samuel Thornton's rejected bride, but I'm standing here now as Clara Whitmore, a woman who chose her own fate. And I choose you, Ethan Cole. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because loving you is the truest thing I've ever felt. Ethan kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise, and Clara kissed him back with her whole heart. Around them, their unfinished house stood waiting to be completed, to be filled with laughter and arguments and quiet evenings, and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that would make up their shared life. They walked back to the main house hand in hand as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow there would be work to do, cattle to tend, repairs to complete, plans to finalize. But tonight, there was just this: the warmth of his hand in hers, the solid presence of him beside her, the knowledge that she'd found her place in the world at last. In the kitchen, Clara put coffee on to brew while Ethan stoked the fire in the stove. The domesticity of the moment felt profound somehow, a preview of the thousands of such moments that would comprise their marriage. She watched him move around the familiar space and felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. 2 weeks, Ethan said, reading her thoughts as he so often did. Then you'll officially be Mrs. Ethan Cole, Are you ready for that? Clara considered the question seriously. Was she ready to tie her life irrevocably to this man, this place, this hard and beautiful existence on the edge of the frontier? Was she ready to trade the security of a trial period with clear endpoints for the uncertainty of forever? More ready than I've ever been for anything, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The coffee perked on the stove, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Outside, the night deepened around the ranch, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the rising moon. Clara poured 2 cups and handed one to Ethan, their fingers brushing in the exchange. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, shoulders touching as they stood by the window and looked out at the land they would build their future on. And Clara knew with absolute certainty that every terrible thing that had happened to bring her to this moment, every loss, every humiliation, every desperate choice, had been worth it. Because it had led her here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this life she was claiming as her own. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity that left Clara breathless. Martha descended on the ranch with the organizational efficiency of a military general, bringing with her a parade of townsfolk eager to help prepare for what she kept calling the social event of the season. Clara protested that such attention was unnecessary, but Martha waved away her concerns with characteristic determination. "This town needs something to celebrate," Martha insisted, standing in the middle of the parlor with fabric swatches spread across every surface. "We've had nothing but trouble with Marcus Brennan and his gang for 2 years. Now he's in jail awaiting trial. You and Ethan are getting married, and folks want to mark the occasion properly. Let them have their joy, Clara." So Clara surrendered to the inevitable and found herself swept up in preparations that seemed to grow more elaborate by the day. The women of Red Hollow organized a quilting bee to create a wedding present, their needles flashing as they gossiped and laughed in Martha's hotel parlor. The men worked double time to finish the interior of the new house, determined to have at least the main rooms completed before the ceremony. Through it all, Clara maintained her regular duties at the ranch, refusing to let excitement interfere with responsibility. She still rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, still tended to Danny's healing leg, still managed the household accounts, and consulted with Ethan on ranch business. If anything, she worked harder than before, driven by a need to prove she could handle both the demands of ranch life and the transition to being Ethan's wife. One afternoon, she was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when Danny limped in on his crutches, his young face serious. "Miss Clara, can I talk to you about something?" She gestured to a chair, wiping flour from her hands. "Of course. How's the leg feeling today?" "Better every day, thanks to you." He settled himself carefully, propping the crutches against the table. "I wanted to say thank you properly, not just for setting my leg, but for everything. When you rode out with Jack that day, you could have been killed. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Clara said simply. "You were hurt and needed help. What else would I have done?" "Most women would have stayed safe in the house like Ethan told you to." Danny's eyes were earnest. "But you're not like most women, are you? You're brave and strong, and you don't let fear stop you from doing what's right." Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I was terrified that whole time, Danny. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the splints. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, isn't it? Being scared, but doing the thing that needs doing." He leaned forward. "I just wanted you to know that all of us, all the boys and Ethan especially, we're real grateful you're here. This ranch was just a place we worked before you came. Now it feels like a home. And when you marry Ethan, well, that'll make it official." After Danny left, Clara stood at the window and let his words wash over her. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived in Red Hollow, convinced her value lay solely in her domestic skills and desperate enough to marry a stranger for security. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime now. Ethan found her there an hour later, still standing at the window with her hands pressed against the glass. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "How strange life is. How 3 months ago I was someone completely different, and now I'm here, about to marry you, and it feels like the most natural thing in the world." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever worry we're moving too fast? That we should wait longer? Make sure this is real?" "Every single day," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice made her love him even more. And then I remember how certain I felt the moment I saw you on that train platform. How every day since then has only confirmed what I already knew. Some things you just recognize, Clara, like coming home after a long journey. Martha says the whole town is planning to attend the wedding. She's talking about roasting a pig and setting up tables in the street. Ethan groaned. I was hoping for something simple. Just us and a few witnesses. Too late for that now. Your future mother-in-law has taken charge. Clara smiled at his expression. Besides, I think she's right. These people need something to celebrate, and we're giving them that. It's not such a terrible thing. As long as I get to marry you at the end of it, Martha can plan whatever she wants. He kissed her forehead. Come on, I want to show you something. He led her out to the new house, where the sound of hammering and sawing filled the air. Tom and Jack were installing windows while Miguel worked on the porch railings. The transformation since Clara had last visited was remarkable. What had been a skeleton was now recognizably a home, with walls and a roof and glass that would keep out the winter wind. The kitchen's finished, Ethan said, guiding her through the front door. I wanted you to see it before the wedding. Clara stepped into the space and felt her breath catch. The kitchen was beautiful in its simplicity. Clean pine cabinets, a large cast-iron stove, a deep sink beneath windows that framed a perfect view of the creek and mountains beyond. There was a work table in the center of the room, already scarred from use, and shelves waiting to be filled with dishes and supplies. Ethan, it's perfect, she whispered, running her hand along the smooth countertop. The bedrooms still need work, and the parlor won't be finished for another few weeks, but I wanted you to have your kitchen ready. He came to stand beside her at the window. I know how much you love to cook, how you put your heart into every meal. You deserved a proper space for it. Clara turned and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the gratitude and love that words seemed inadequate to express. When they finally broke apart, she noticed Miguel standing in the doorway with an embarrassed grin. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but Jack wants to know if you approve the placement of the bedroom window. Tell him it's fine, Ethan said without taking his eyes off Clara. And tell the boys they can knock off early today. They've done good work. After the men left, Ethan and Clara walked through the unfinished house together, planning where furniture would go and debating paint colors for the walls. The intimacy of making these decisions together filled Clara with a contentment she'd never known existed. This was partnership in its truest form, not one person dictating while the other obeyed, but two people building something together through compromise and shared vision. I was thinking, Clara said as they stood in what would become their bedroom, that we could put shelves here for books, create a small library just for us. I'd like that. Ethan pulled her close. Though I have to warn you, if we put books in the bedroom, I'm going to spend half my time reading instead of sleeping. I'm counting on it. Some of my favorite memories from these past months are our evening conversations about literature. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I love that you value my mind as much as my other qualities. Your mind is one of your most attractive qualities, he said seriously. The fact that you can discuss philosophy and poetry and still know how to set a broken leg or balance account books. Clara, do you have any idea how remarkable you are? I'm just a woman who learned to make the best of circumstances. No, you're a woman who refuses to be limited by what other people think she should be. That's entirely different. The next week passed in a blur of final preparations. Clara's wedding dress was a simple but elegant affair, pale blue silk that Martha had somehow procured from a merchant in Denver. It fit her perfectly, hugging her waist before flowing to the floor in soft folds. When Clara tried it on for the first time, Martha had tears streaming down her face. You look like an angel, the older woman said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Ethan's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you. The night before the wedding, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in the cook's quarters, for the last time, she realized, and listened to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Ethan Cole, and this temporary arrangement that had saved her life would transform into something permanent and precious. She rose quietly and padded into the kitchen, intending to make tea. But she found Ethan already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a thoughtful expression. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, moving to sit across from him. Too much on my mind. He reached across the table and took her hand. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. A flutter of anxiety moved through her chest. What is it? Are you sure about this? About me? About staying here? About giving up any other life you might have had? His gray-blue eyes were serious in the lamplight. Because once we say those vows tomorrow, I'm going to hold you to them. I'm going to love you and cherish you and do everything in my power to make you happy for the rest of our lives. But I need to know you want that too. Not just because it's better than what you left behind, but because it's what you truly want. Clara stood and moved around the table to him. He pulled her onto his lap, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, looking directly into his eyes so he could see the truth of her words. I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life, she said firmly. I'm not settling for you, Ethan. I'm choosing you. There's a world of difference between those two things. When I answered Samuel Thornton's advertisement, I was settling. I was accepting whatever scraps of security and respect I could find. But with you, I'm not accepting scraps. I'm claiming everything, love and partnership and passion and purpose. I'm choosing a life that challenges me and fulfills me and makes me want to be better than I ever thought I could be. She touched his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw against her palm. So yes, I'm sure. I'm so sure that it scares me sometimes. But it's a good kind of fear, the kind that comes from realizing you're standing on the edge of something wonderful and vast and completely unknown. Ethan kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Clara kissed him back with all the certainty in her heart. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Tomorrow, he said softly, tomorrow you become my wife, and I become the luckiest man in Colorado Territory. We should try to sleep, Clara said reluctantly. Martha will have my head if I show up with dark circles under my eyes. But neither of them moved. They sat together in the quiet kitchen as the night deepened around them, talking in low voices about their hopes and dreams and fears. Ethan told her about his childhood on the ranch, about his parents who had carved a home out of wilderness through sheer determination. Clara spoke of her mother's gentle wisdom and her father's failed attempts to provide for his family with dignity. I wish they could have known each other, Clara said wistfully. My father would have liked you. He always said the measure of a man wasn't in how much money he had, but in how he treated the people who depended on him. I wish I could have known them too. Asked your father properly for your hand. Ethan's arms tightened around her, but I like to think they'd approve of this match. They would, Clara said with certainty. My mother especially. She always told me to trust my instincts, to listen to my heart even when my head was shouting warnings. I think she'd be pleased that I finally learned that lesson. Eventually, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they separated reluctantly. Ethan walked Clara to her door and kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that made her chest ache. The next time I kiss you, you'll be my wife, he said against her lips. I can't wait, Clara whispered back. She managed a few hours of sleep before Martha arrived with an entourage of women, all chattering excitedly about the day's festivities. They swept Clara away in a tide of feminine energy, helping her bathe and dress and arrange her hair in an elaborate style that felt foreign but beautiful. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror, Clara barely recognized the woman staring back. The pale blue silk dress made her dark hair and eyes seem even darker. The happiness radiating from her transformed her features, softening the worry lines and bringing color to her cheeks. She looked young and hopeful and utterly content. You're beautiful, Martha said, coming to stand behind her. And not just on the outside. Ethan is a lucky man, Clara Whitmore, but I think you're pretty lucky too. I know I am, Clara replied, meeting Martha's eyes in the mirror. 3 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it's just beginning. The ceremony was set for late afternoon, when the harsh heat of the day had mellowed into golden warmth. The entire town had indeed turned out, just as Martha had predicted. Tables laden with food lined the main street of Red Hollow, and someone had strung bunting between the buildings in festive colors. Children ran wild between the adults, their excitement adding to the celebratory atmosphere. But Clara barely noticed any of it. Her entire focus was on the small church at the end of the street, where Ethan waited for her on the steps, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit. Miguel, Jack, Tom, and a fully recovered Danny stood with him, all dressed in their Sunday best and grinning like fools. The walk down the street felt both eternal and instantaneous. Clara moved through a blur of smiling faces and shouted congratulations, her hand resting on Martha's arm for support. And then she was there, standing before Ethan, looking up into his eyes and seeing everything she needed to know reflected back at her. The minister from Red Hollow was a kind-faced man named Reverend Phillips, who'd known Ethan since childhood. He kept the ceremony brief and heartfelt, speaking of love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. When it came time for the vows, Ethan's voice was strong and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Clara for all the days of his life. Clara's voice trembled slightly as she made the same promises, but the words came from the deepest part of her soul. She meant every syllable with a conviction that surprised even herself. This wasn't a practical arrangement or a desperate compromise. This was a choice made freely, a commitment entered into with open eyes and an open heart. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Phillips said with a broad smile. "Ethan, you may kiss your bride." And Ethan did, thoroughly and enthusiastically, while the gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Clara kissed him back, laughing against his mouth, feeling joy bubble up inside her like champagne. The celebration that followed was everything Martha had promised and more. There was indeed a roasted pig, along with more food than Clara had ever seen in one place. There was music and dancing, with someone producing a fiddle and another a harmonica. Ethan proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, guiding Clara through reels and waltzes with confident grace. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, breathless and happy as he spun her across the makeshift dance floor. "My mother insisted all her children learn proper social graces," he said with a grin. "Said you never knew when such skills might come in handy. I think she'd be pleased to see me finally putting them to use." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Ethan pulled Clara away from the celebration. They slipped away quietly, mounting his horse and riding toward the ranch, while the party continued without them. "Shouldn't we stay?" Clara asked, though she made no real protest as they left the noise and crowds behind. "We've done our duty. Let them celebrate without us." Ethan's arms tightened around her waist as they rode. "I want to show you something." They bypassed the old ranch house entirely and headed straight for the new one. Clara noticed immediately that lamps were lit inside, their warm glow visible through the windows. As they drew closer, she saw that the porch was decorated with wildflowers, and the door stood open in invitation. Ethan helped her down from the horse and then, to her surprise, swept her up in his arms. "I believe there's a tradition about carrying brides over thresholds," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Ethan Cole, put me down before you hurt yourself." "Not a chance, Mrs. Cole. I've been waiting 3 months to do this properly." He carried her through the doorway and into their new home. The kitchen was spotless and welcoming, with a fire burning in the stove and the scent of fresh bread filling the air. Someone, probably Martha, had stocked the shelves and filled the pantry. There were wildflowers in a vase on the table and clean curtains at the windows. But it was when Ethan carried her into the bedroom that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. The room was completely finished, with a beautiful bed covered in the quilt the town women had made, a wardrobe against one wall, and those bookshelves she'd requested already installed and waiting to be filled. Candles cast soft light across everything, creating an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy. "The boys finished it while we were in town," Ethan explained, setting her gently on her feet. "They wanted you to have a proper wedding night in a proper home." Clara turned slowly, taking in every detail of the room that would be theirs. "It's perfect. Everything is perfect." She moved to the window and looked out at the view she would wake to every morning for the rest of her life. The creek winding through the valley, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, the vast sky already beginning to fill with stars. Ethan came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Clara turned in his arms and looked up at the man who was now her husband. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain and loss and desperate choices, the humiliation on that train platform, the unexpected kindness that had offered her a second chance. She thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming, and about all the ways this rough frontier life had transformed her understanding of what happiness could mean. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Ethan kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise. Claire kissed him back, feeling the last of her fears and doubts dissolve into the certainty of this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, harsh winters and difficult seasons, the endless work of building a life together, they would face them as partners, as equals, as two people who had found in each other something precious and worth fighting for. Later, lying in their new bed with Ethan's arm around her and her head resting on his chest, Clara listened to the night sounds filtering through the window, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the eternal song of the creek. This was her home now. These were her sounds, her land, her life. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked sleepily, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "That I was wrong about so many things. I thought I needed security and predictability. I thought the best I could hope for was a practical arrangement with a man who would tolerate me in exchange for domestic service. I thought my value was limited to what I could do for others." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "But you taught me that I deserve more than tolerance. That partnership means building something together, not one person serving the other. That love isn't about settling for what you can get, but choosing what you truly want." "You taught me something too," Ethan said, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'd forgotten how to hope for anything beyond survival, how to imagine a future that included joy and companionship and all the small moments that make life worth living. You reminded me that the ranch isn't just land and cattle. It's a home, and it needs someone to bring it to life." "We brought it to life together," Clara corrected gently. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Neither of us could have done this alone." They fell asleep in each other's arms as the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood watch in the darkness. And when Clara woke the next morning to find sunlight streaming through the window and her husband sleeping peacefully beside her, she felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was her life now. Not the life she'd planned or the life she'd expected, but something infinitely better. A life she'd chosen freely, with a man who valued her completely, in a place that had given her room to become more than she'd ever imagined possible. The rejected bride had found her home at last. The first year of marriage brought challenges Clara had never anticipated, but also joys that exceeded her wildest dreams. The autumn after their wedding arrived with a vengeance, bringing early snows that tested every skill she'd acquired over the summer months. She learned to preserve food in quantities that seemed absurd, until she understood how isolated they would become once winter truly set in. She learned to read the sky for signs of approaching storms and to prepare the house against winds that howled down from the mountains with terrifying force. But she also discovered the profound intimacy of long winter evenings spent by the fire with Ethan, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about everything and nothing. She found unexpected pleasure in the rhythm of their shared life, in the small domestic rituals that bound them together more surely than any formal vows. The way he always checked the stove before bed because he knew she worried about fires. The way she kept his coffee cup filled during breakfast without him having to ask. 1,000 tiny considerations that added up to love in its most practical and enduring form. In early November, a letter arrived from Clara's cousin Margaret in Philadelphia. Clara had written to her shortly after the wedding, describing her new life and cautiously extending an invitation to visit. Now, holding Margaret's response in trembling hands, she read words that made her heart ache with familiar pain. The family business had finally collapsed completely. Margaret was living in a boarding house and working as a seamstress for barely enough to cover her rent. The carefully phrased sentences couldn't quite hide the desperation bleeding through every word, and Clara recognized her own story from 6 months earlier reflected back at her. "What is it?" Ethan asked, looking up from the ranch accounts he'd been reviewing. Clara handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his face as he read, saw the moment understanding dawned, and knew what his response would be even before he spoke. "Write to her," he said simply. "Tell her we'll send money for the train ticket. There's work here if she wants it, and if not, at least she'll have time to figure out her next step without starving in the process." "You don't even know her," Clara protested, though her heart swelled with gratitude. "She might be completely unsuited for frontier life. She might hate it here. She might." Or she might find exactly what she needs, the same way you did. Ethan set down the letter and pulled Clara onto his lap. Besides, you need another woman around here. Martha's wonderful, but she's an hour away in town. Having your cousin here would be good for you. So Clara wrote back immediately, and 6 weeks later she stood on the same train platform where Samuel Thornton had rejected her, waiting to greet the cousin she hadn't seen in 3 years. When Margaret stepped down from the passenger car, Clara barely recognized her. The vibrant young woman she remembered had been replaced by someone gaunt and worn, with shadows under her eyes and a wariness in her posture that spoke of too many disappointments. But when Margaret saw Clara, something in her face transformed. She rushed forward and the two women embraced fiercely, both crying and laughing at once. "Look at you," Margaret said, pulling back to study Clara's face. "You're absolutely glowing. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Life agrees with me," Clara corrected. "Come on, I want you to meet Ethan." The introductions were slightly awkward, as such things always were, but Ethan's quiet kindness soon put Margaret at ease. By the time they reached the ranch, she was asking questions about the landscape and the livestock, her natural curiosity beginning to overcome her exhaustion. Clara had prepared the spare bedroom in the old ranch house, which now served primarily as quarters for the ranch hands and overflow guests. She'd made it as welcoming as possible, with fresh curtains and wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. Margaret stood in the doorway and stared at the simple room with an expression Clara couldn't quite decipher. "It's not much," Clara began apologetically, "but—" "It's perfect," Margaret interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "Clara, you have no idea. The boarding house where I've been living had 6 women sharing 2 rooms. This feels like a palace." Over the following weeks, Clara watched her cousin slowly come back to life. The good food and clean air worked wonders, erasing the gauntness from her face and replacing it with healthy color. Margaret proved to be naturally skilled with animals, spending hours in the barn helping Miguel care for the horses. She had a gift for soothing even the most skittish creatures, and Miguel began teaching her everything he knew about horse breeding and training. "Your cousin has a real talent," Miguel told Clara one evening as they all sat around the dinner table in the new house. "I've never seen anyone pick up horsemanship so quickly. She's got the touch." Margaret blushed at the compliment, but Clara could see the pleasure in her eyes. It was the same look she herself must have worn when she first realized she could be valued for more than just her domestic skills. As winter deepened, the ranch settled into a quieter rhythm. The cattle were brought down from the high pastures to weather the cold months closer to the barn. The men spent their days repairing equipment, mending fences, and preparing for spring. Clara and Margaret worked together in the kitchen, preserving the last of the garden vegetables, and baking enough bread to feed the small army of hungry men. It was during one of these kitchen sessions that Margaret finally opened up about what had driven her west. "I was engaged," she said quietly, not meeting Clara's eyes as she kneaded dough, "to a banker's son. Very respectable, very proper. But when father's business failed and the debts came due, he ended the engagement immediately. Said his family couldn't be associated with scandal." Her hand stilled on the dough. The worst part wasn't losing him. It was realizing he'd never actually cared about me at all. I was just a suitable match as long as I came with a proper dowry. Clara reached across the table and squeezed her cousin's flour-dusted hand. "I understand more than you know. We both learned the hard way that some men only value women for what they bring to the transaction." "But Ethan's not like that, is he?" Margaret's eyes were searching. "The way he looks at you, the way he asks your opinion about ranch business, he sees you as an equal." "He does. It took me a long time to believe it, but yes, he truly does." Clara smiled at the wonder of it. "And there are other men like him out here, Margaret, men who value strength and competence over social standing or dowries." She was thinking of Miguel as she said it, and apparently her thoughts were transparent because Margaret's cheeks flushed pink. "Miguel is very kind," she said carefully. "He's been teaching me so much about horses. He's a good man, honest and hardworking and gentle despite all the rough edges." Clara chose her words carefully. "He lost his wife and daughter to cholera about 8 years ago. Came out here to start over, same as many of us. He's been alone a long time." Margaret didn't respond, but Clara saw the thoughtful expression on her face and smiled to herself. Sometimes the best thing you could do for the people you loved was simply open doors and let them decide whether to walk through. Christmas that year was unlike anything Clara had experienced before. In Philadelphia, the holiday had been a formal affair of church services and polite dinner parties. Here on the ranch, it was a communal celebration that brought together everyone who worked the land. Martha and her son Jack came out from town, along with several other families from Red Hollow. The men roasted a deer that Tom had shot, and the women contributed pies and cakes and dishes that filled the tables to overflowing. Ethan gave Clara a beautiful leather-bound journal with blank pages waiting to be filled. "For writing down recipes," he explained, "or thoughts, or whatever you want. I've noticed you scribbling notes on scraps of paper. Thought you deserved something better." Clara gave him a new rifle, purchased with money she'd saved from managing the household accounts so efficiently. "The old one was starting to misfire," she said, "and I need you coming home safely every evening." But the real gift came later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet. They stood together on the porch of their home, looking out at the star-scattered sky, and Clara told Ethan the news she'd been holding close for the past week. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. "The baby should come in early summer." Ethan's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, joy, fear, wonder, before settling on something that looked like reverence. He pulled her close, one hand coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "Clara, are you sure?" "I'm sure. I wasn't certain at first, but Martha confirmed it when she was here last week." Clara leaned into his warmth. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it." His voice was rough with emotion. "Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful beyond words, but yes, incredibly happy." They stood together under the stars, planning a future that now included not just the two of them, but a child who would grow up knowing this land and this life. Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she'd arrived in Red Hollow, broken and desperate, convinced her childbearing years would pass without ever knowing motherhood. Now she was going to have a baby with the man she loved, in a home they'd built together, surrounded by a community that had become her family. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the long winter months. Margaret proved invaluable, taking over many of Clara's heavier duties and fussing over her like a mother hen. The ranch hands treated Clara as if she were made of spun glass, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a mixing bowl and jumping to fulfill her every request. "You're all being ridiculous," Clara protested one morning when Miguel literally carried a basket of laundry out of her hands. "I'm pregnant, not dying. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not women carrying Ethan's babies," Miguel said with a grin. "He'd have all our hides if anything happened to you." Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers and newborn calves. The herd had survived the winter with minimal losses, and the breeding stock Ethan had purchased was proving to be an excellent investment. The ranch was thriving, and with it, everyone who called it home. Margaret and Miguel's courtship had progressed with a quiet inevitability that pleased everyone who witnessed it. They were married in April, in a simple ceremony that mirrored Clara and Ethan's, and Ethan gave them a piece of land adjacent to the main ranch where they could build their own home and raise horses. "Are you sure?" Miguel had asked, stunned by the generosity. "This is Cole land. It's been in your family for generations." "And now your family too," Ethan said simply. "Clara's cousin is my cousin, which makes you my brother. Besides, this ranch needs good horse stock, and you're the best horseman I've ever known. This is as much a business decision as anything else." But Clara knew better. She saw the way Ethan looked at the growing community forming around their ranch. Not just employees or hired hands, but a true family bound by choice and shared purpose. This was what he'd been building toward all along, she realized. Not just a successful cattle operation, but a place where people could find belonging and second chances. Clara's labor began on a hot June afternoon while she was picking vegetables in the garden. The first contraction doubled her over with its intensity, and by the time she made it back to the house, she knew the baby would come soon. Martha had moved out to the ranch 2 weeks earlier, insisting she would stay until after the birth. Now she took charge with calm efficiency, sending Jack racing to fetch the doctor from town while she helped Clara into bed and prepared everything they would need. Ethan paced the parlor like a caged animal, his face pale with worry. Miguel and the other ranch hands tried to distract him with talk of ranch business, but his attention kept drifting to the closed bedroom door where Clara's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain could be heard. The labor lasted 8 hours, not unusually long for a first baby, Martha kept assuring everyone, though Ethan looked like he might be sick every time Clara cried out. Margaret held her cousin's hand through the worst of it, murmuring encouragement and wiping sweat from Clara's forehead. Finally, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, a baby's wail filled the house. "It's a girl," Martha announced, her face wreathed in smiles as she wrapped the squalling infant in a soft blanket. A beautiful, healthy baby girl with a set of lungs that'll serve her well out here. Clara was exhausted, trembling with the aftermath of labor, but when Martha placed the baby in her arms, she felt a surge of love so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. The baby had dark hair like Clara's, and eyes that would probably turn the same gray-blue as Ethan's. She was perfect in every way. The door burst open and Ethan rushed in, his composure finally cracking. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Clara's arms with an expression of absolute wonder. "Meet your daughter," Clara said softly, shifting so he could see the baby's face more clearly. Ethan reached out with one trembling finger and touched the baby's cheek. The infant turned toward his touch, her tiny mouth working, and something inside him seemed to crack open. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at his wife and daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Clara, she's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Clara asked, though she already knew what she wanted. "I was thinking Sarah," Ethan said quietly. "After my mother and my first wife. Both strong women who loved this land." He hesitated. "But only if you're comfortable with that." Clara thought about the woman whose house she'd first cleaned, whose books she'd organized, whose memory had haunted the edges of her early days at the ranch. Sarah Cole had loved Ethan, had loved this place, and had died too young to see all it would become. Naming their daughter after her felt right, like honoring the past while building the future. "Sarah Cole," she said, testing the name. "I love it." The first months of motherhood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Clara had read books about infant care, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of a newborn who needed feeding every few hours and seemed to have her days and nights completely reversed. But Ethan was a devoted father, walking the floor with Sarah when she was fussy and changing diapers without complaint. Miguel and Margaret were constant helpers, and Martha came out from town regularly to provide advice and extra hands. As summer turned to autumn and Sarah grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling baby, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had been just over a year since she'd stepped off that train in Red Hollow, humiliated and desperate, certain her life was over. Now she stood in the kitchen of the home she and Ethan had built together, watching through the window as her husband showed their daughter the horses in the corral. Margaret and Miguel were building their own house on the adjacent property, their laughter carrying on the wind as they worked. The ranch hands had become like brothers, showing up at the house for meals and staying to play with baby Sarah. Martha visited weekly, bringing news from town and help with whatever projects Clara had underway. The lending library they'd established in Martha's hotel had become wildly successful, with people traveling from neighboring ranches just to borrow books. Clara had started teaching basic reading and arithmetic to some of the local children on Sunday afternoons, using Ethan's extensive library as a resource. The community was growing, thriving, becoming something neither of them could have built alone. One evening in late October, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Clara and Ethan sat together on the porch of their home. Sarah was sleeping peacefully in her cradle just inside, and the autumn air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Ethan asked, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "About how different everything could have been?" "Sometimes," Clara admitted. "I think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day, if you hadn't offered me that job." She turned to look at him in the fading light. "But mostly, I think about how grateful I am that Samuel Thornton rejected me. Because if he hadn't, I would have married him out of desperation, and I never would have found you. I never would have discovered what real partnership looks like." "Samuel Thornton is an idiot," Ethan said with feeling. "Best thing he ever did was let you go." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. He actually did me a tremendous favor, though I certainly didn't see it that way at the time. That's the thing about second chances, Ethan mused. Sometimes what looks like failure or rejection is actually just life clearing the path for something better. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. In the distance, they could hear Miguel and Margaret talking as they worked on framing their new house. Closer, the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, horses nickering softly, cattle lowing, the creek's eternal whisper. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about expanding the library program, maybe starting a proper school here on the ranch. There are more families moving into the area all the time, and their children need education." "I think that's a wonderful idea." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "You could teach in the old ranch house. We're barely using it now anyway, and it's big enough to hold a dozen students easily. Would you mind? It would take time away from my other work." "Clara, you've already proven you can manage a household, a baby, and half a dozen other projects without breaking a sweat. If you want to start a school, start a school. I'll support you in whatever you want to do." It was that simple belief in her capabilities, that absolute faith in her judgment, that still took Clara's breath away sometimes. She'd spent so much of her life being told what women could and couldn't do, what was proper and what was scandalous, that having a husband who simply trusted her to make good decisions felt revolutionary. The school opened the following spring, with 8 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Clara taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, using Ethan's books and her own extensive education. She discovered she loved teaching, loved watching young minds grasp new concepts and develop confidence in their own abilities. The ranch continued to prosper. The cattle herd grew. The horse breeding program Margaret and Miguel had started produced animals that were in high demand throughout the territory, and the land itself seemed to respond to the careful stewardship Ethan provided. They hired additional ranch hands, built more outbuildings, and gradually transformed the Double C from a modest operation into one of the most successful ranches in the region. But more important than the financial success was the community they'd created. The ranch became a gathering place for families throughout the valley, a place where people came for advice, for help during hard times, for celebration during good times. Clara's kitchen was rarely empty, and she loved it that way. 2 years after Sarah's birth, Clara delivered a son they named James after her father. 3 years after that, another daughter arrived, whom they called Elizabeth. The house rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life, and Clara thrived in the midst of it all. On a warm evening in late summer, nearly 10 years after that fateful day at the train station, Clara stood on the porch of their home and surveyed the life she'd built. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. In the yard, Ethan was teaching Sarah, now a confident 9-year-old with her mother's determination and her father's steady nature, how to properly saddle a horse. 6-year-old James was helping Miguel repair a fence, his small hands clumsy but eager. 3-year-old Elizabeth was picking wildflowers with Margaret, both of them laughing at some private joke. The school Clara had started now had 20 students and a second teacher she'd hired from back east. The lending library had expanded into a small bookshop that Martha ran with enthusiasm. The ranch employed 15 men and supported 3 families who lived on adjacent properties. The community they dreamed of building had become reality, solid and thriving and full of life. Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off that train, desperate, humiliated, convinced her best years were behind her at 26. She thought about Samuel Thornton's cold rejection, about the fear and uncertainty that had consumed her in those first terrible hours in Red Hollow. And then she thought about Ethan's quiet offer of employment, about the chance he'd given her to prove herself on her own terms. She thought about falling in love unexpectedly, about learning what true partnership meant, about discovering strengths she'd never known she possessed. The journey from rejected mail-order bride to successful rancher's wife, mother, teacher, and community leader had been neither quick nor easy. There had been setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and fear, but every struggle had taught her something valuable about herself and about the life she was capable of building. Ethan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Clara said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "How far we've come. How different everything is from what I expected. Better or worse than what you expected. She turned in his arms to face him, looking up at the man who'd given her so much more than just a job or security. He'd given her a partnership built on mutual respect, love that deepened with every passing year, and the freedom to become the woman she was meant to be. "Better," she said simply. "So much better than anything I could have imagined." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars began to appear, Clara looked out at the valley spread before them, at the ranch they'd built together, at the children who would carry forward their legacy, at the community that had formed around their shared vision of what life could be. She thought about second chances and unexpected kindness, about the difference between settling for what you could get and choosing what you truly wanted. She thought about the strength it took to start over, to trust again, to open your heart after it had been broken. Most of all, she thought about love. Not the desperate, fearful grasping she'd felt when she'd answered that advertisement, but the steady, certain love that came from truly knowing someone and being known in return. The kind of love that was built day by day through shared work and honest communication and the simple choice to stand together against whatever challenges life presented. The rejected bride had found her home, her purpose, and a love that exceeded anything she'd dared to dream. And standing there on the porch of the house they'd built, surrounded by the life they'd created, Clara understood that sometimes the best things came not from the plans you made, but from the courage to embrace the unexpected paths that opened before you. Ethan kissed her forehead and then called to the children that supper would be ready soon. Sarah came running with her usual boundless energy, James following at a more measured pace, Elizabeth toddling behind with her fistful of wildflowers. They gathered on the porch, this family that had been forged from loss and loneliness into something beautiful and enduring. And as they walked together into the warm, lamplit kitchen filled with the scent of fresh bread and the promise of good food and better company, Clara felt a profound gratitude for every twist of fate that had led her to this moment. The summer evening stretched ahead of them, full of laughter and conversation and all the small, precious moments that made up a life well lived. And Clara knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because it was the only option available to her, but because she had chosen it freely, built it intentionally, and claimed it as her own. This was home. This was family. This was the life that had been waiting for her all along, on the other side of rejection and fear, in the heart of the wild Colorado territory where a desperate woman had found unexpected redemption and a love that would last forever.